Thank you. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be joining you today and presenting the pharmacology perspective on study designs and approaches to early phase therapeutic development for older cancer patients. I have to first thank Drs. Bertinoli and Singh for putting together this very exciting and important event, and Dr. Harvey and Dr. Subia for inviting me to participate. In giving you this pharmacology perspective, I want to just explain that we don't have problems, but we have some very real and new challenges that are clearly the consequence of success in cancer therapy development in the past 10 years. And so I'm going to point out these challenges, but I want you to come away with the idea that there's tremendous opportunity and there are solutions, and that's what's so exciting about participating in the meeting today. So looking at this slide, if we go back to 2008 and you opened a page in the brochure from Pharma Foundation, you would see this figure depicting the enormous expenses and time commitments to select among a large number of potential new medicines and bring them through the serial process of testing in phase 1, 2, and 3 trials before submitting for FDA review and ultimately, hopefully, having an FDA-approved medication. As folks attending this session are very well aware, in cancer therapeutics, things have changed quite a bit in the last 12, 13-year period. My colleague Tina Annunziata at National Cancer Institute generously provided this slide a few years ago, and she highlights here what many folks, again, attending this session are aware of, is the greater incorporation of biomarkers in early phase development, the greater understanding of the molecular pathology of cancer has enabled us to fast track a number of agents through the development process, and in fact, obtain approvals off of phase 1 trials or to jump from phase 1 into phase 3 trials. I mentioned to Tina at that time that I wanted to be able to edit the slide in some ways, and she encouraged me to do so to highlight the following point, which is that process of leveraging scientific knowledge and new technology has actually shrunk the timelines for taking drugs through clinical trials, and it's shrunk the number of participants in studies. And so consequently, we now have, for example, in 2020, 15 FDA-approved new molecular entities for cancer indications. But with the shrinking of the timelines, there's an enormous deficit in knowledge about the drugs, about how patients vary in their metabolism of and response to drugs. And it means that in the post-approval setting, there's a lot more work to do. And a good example of the relative lack of information, I took the first 4 drugs on the list alphabetically, turned to section 8.5 in the FDA label on geriatric use. And you see there's fairly common commentary that there's few differences identified between older patients and younger patients, or that there's insufficient number of patients enrolled to be able to draw any conclusions. And this highlights a key point that I hope we all recognize, is that development in the early phase these days is so intense. It involves competitive racing among multiple sponsors. With fewer patients enrolled in studies, of course, we know less, but it's a huge challenge to get through this competitive environment because with the new development of new agents, the actual treatment paradigm for any given disease can change even in the setting of this rapid pace of drug development. So in the post-marketing setting over here in the purple field, we try to get our patients access to these drugs, and we try to get off-label use where it seems indicated. This can be very time-consuming and it constrains access for patients. When we finally go through that gauntlet and get access to a new agent for a patient, we can have limited motivation or time to be able to do any research at that point. When we can do research, it's usually obtaining and evaluating whatever data is conveniently available. This is in stark contrast to what we've known from clinical pharmacology principles for decades. And so this concept was brought forward by Lou Scheiner in a classic paper from 1997. What do you actually need to know about a drug when it first becomes available? An appropriate initial dose for the patient, how soon the intended effect will start, how long it will last. I'm not going to read the rest of the slide to you. I'm just going to keep it up there to explain that more recently, an analysis of a large number of agents approved by the FDA revealed that many development plans have just simply not adhered to clinical pharmacology principles and have limited information on the relationship between the dose you give, the actual exposure the patient's body has to the drug over time, and the relationship between that exposure, the ultimate response of the disease, or tolerability and safety issues in response. And these are pertinent to the questions we're addressing today. A key point I want to leave you with is that with evaluation of new drugs in older patients, we need to move beyond paying attention to age alone. Elegant work by some of the folks attending this meeting here today, published back in 2016, demonstrated that basic, simple risk scoring of older patients requires an assessment of many different domains. And those are highlighted on the right side of the slide in different colors. And what we know from geriatric medical care is that oftentimes the problems that patients have are not a consequence of their age or one big issue, but rather many small issues that are difficult to trace over time and seem to catch us by surprise. And so the goal of studying drugs in older patients right now really should be to identify for each individual drug among these many potential predictors, which are the ones that really count when it comes to making the decisions about whether to treat, what dose to treat, how to adjust that medication for the patient, or whether to select another drug altogether rather than take a patient through the challenges of using a new agent. In order to tackle these questions, our team has tried to innovate in early phase clinical trial designs to get more information together during the course of development. We submitted this concept to CTEP, and there's the date, April 24th, 2015. Where we got together with some geriatric experts and suggested that one might design a trial where you have many different groups that you aim to fill in order to perform a basic clinical pharmacology assessment. And so patients are segregated by age, but also by organ function and by their risk score from that geriatric assessment. Now, we didn't have a primary hypothesis of great importance, but rather needed to get the experience working among both early phase drug developers and geriatricians and be able to collect important detailed information across the full spectrum of variation among older patients and pharmacology of one drug. That can be quite burdensome, and it was not approved at the time of submission. This is included here for future reference and to discuss after the presentation. So, given the complexities of introducing these types of studies into earlier phases of development, more recently our team collaborated with experts in population control and population studies in oncology at the University of Virginia Cancer Center. And we aim to work with our geriatricians and incorporate home visits as a mechanism for performing more detailed evaluations of patients rather than requiring patients to come back to the center. We plan to use new technologies like actimetry and patient response measures on iPads, and to perform fairly comprehensive assessment across many different domains that might affect the patient's ability to tolerate a drug, so that we might have deeper learning on how best to predict what patients can tolerate and how we can better adapt treatments to obtain better outcomes for this complex population. And so in summary, and I'm very open to discussing this in the panel, I want to leave you with the idea of one, we can't forget clinical pharmacology. Empiric drug development has been highly favored recently, but it runs into limitations, and we're recognizing those now. So every project in this space really needs a clinical pharmacologist to help address some basic matters. The second issue is that it's time to take all of this to a higher level. I think many of us here recognize that age is not a major determinant, and that age is really just a surrogate for much more complex use of medications and higher generalized risk. And finally, there are many challenges to innovating in interdisciplinary research like this, and many solutions ought to be directed in the next several years to figuring out how we can better stimulate the level of innovation we need to achieve our intended goals. And with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion with the panel. Thank you.